Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Amalia Mesa. My pronouns are she, her, they, them, and I'm the managing director of Speak Out, the Institute for Democratic Education and Culture, and producer of the Speak Out Ed Talks webinar series. Speak Out is a mission-driven speakers bureau and education institute encouraging critical and imaginative thinking to address the major inequities of our day and transform a fractured world. I'm so excited and honored to have you all join us for today's webinar presented by Deepa Iyer, Mapping Our Roles for Social Change in Times of Crisis. I want to let you know that we will be having more webinars and some special events starting this Friday with a May Day message from Angela Davis, also an event with Dolores Huerta, Reclaiming Cinco de Mayo next Tuesday, May 5th, and an incredible Speak Out commencement address for all 2020 graduates and anyone who wants to be inspired. The address will be delivered by Sonia Renee Taylor and an opening performance by Madam Gandhi. You can get more info on those by going to our website, speakoutnow.org, and clicking on the special virtual events box in the homepage. We're also offering virtual programming for campuses and community groups, so you can bring one of our speakers to your group remotely, keynotes, workshops, trainings. You can see all the amazing speakers and artists who are part of our organization, again, at speakoutnow.org. Also, a survey will pop up at the end, so please consider filling it out and making a donation to a fund we've set up to support our organization and our speakers and artists who've been severely impacted by the loss of engagements due to the pandemic. All right, so we have planned for an hour today. So for the last 15 minutes, we'll hold a Q&A, and if any questions come up for you while Deepa's presenting, please put them in the Q&A tab at the bottom, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can. We'll also be utilizing the chat feature today. So throughout the presentation, it's just an interactive piece. Just make sure to be respectful, keep the commenting contained to the subject matter. We will be recording this webinar, so you can access it at any time, and we'll also be sending out an email today with the recording and any resources, articles, links that are mentioned in today's presentation. Also, if you need to, you can adjust the view of the screen at the top of the Zoom window so you can see better. So we are so grateful to have Deepa Iyer with us today. She's a Speak Out speaker, a South Asian American writer, strategist, lawyer, and racial justice advocate. She is the strategic advisor at Building Movement Project and director of Solidarity Is. Deepa has served as executive director of South Asian Americans Leading Together, SALT, for a decade and has held positions at Race Forward, the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, the Asian Pacific American Legal Resource Center, and the Asian American Justice Center. Deepa's first book, We Too Sing America, South Asian, Arab, Muslim, and Sikh Immigrants Shape Our Multicultural Future, received a 2016 American Book Award. She hosts a podcast called Solidarity Is This to explore solidarity practices around the country. She has prepared an incredible presentation for us today. Deepa, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Amalia. I'm so excited to be here. Hello, everyone. I really appreciate so many folks joining us for this workshop. I want to start by saying Ramadan Mubarak to all of those folks who are observing. And I want to also, again, express my gratitude to Amalia Mesa and the entire Speak Out team, as well as to those of you who are here with us. This was a surprisingly large turnout. I think that when we first started to fashion this conversation, I thought it would be about 40 people and we would have an intimate workshop setting. It's great that it's around 300 plus folks that are joining us today. And so we've formatted this webinar a little bit in order to both have some interaction time using the chat feature and the Q&A feature if you have questions for me, as Amalia said, but also some time for you all to do some work on the mapping framework I'm going to be talking about. And then I'll also be in conversation with Dr. Cynthia Langtu, who is an amazing professor and activist, and we'll talk a little bit about how to use this framework in our lives as well as in our ecosystems. So before I get started, I just actually wanted to take a moment and thank you all again for being here, and also recognize that this is a moment of tremendous uncertainty for many of us. I know that many of us are moving through personal loss or are being deeply affected by grief, directly or vicariously. I know that many of us are playing different roles, whether it is in our home or our work lives, and our day-to-day lives have shifted a bit. And we recognize that some of us have the privilege to make those shifts while others don't. Many of us are putting plans on pause. And so you all are coming today to a conversation carrying all of that. And I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge it. And I hope for the next hour and 5 to 10 minutes, we'll have a chance to provide some space that gives you some clarity and some realignment, and also provides a refuge of sorts for you. So because we can't actually get every single person's voice in here, I did want to use the chat function to ask you if you could actually introduce yourselves, if you'd like to, if you could say your name, where you're joining us from, or your organizational affiliation, if you'd like to share that, and an aspiration that you might have for today's workshop. So feel free to use the chat to do that. I'd love to see who's here and where you're coming in from and what your aspirations might be. I know that we've got a tremendous mix of people joining us. Looking at the list of folks who registered, we have people who are teachers, we have people who are working in the nonprofit sector, students, we've got folks in philanthropy, folks in the leadership development sector. So a real range of people who are interested in thinking about using this framework, which is great. I'm already hearing some folks jumping in. People are saying that they are teacher coaches. I see folks here who are working with the Center for Nonprofit Engagement. I see pastor. I see someone who's an undergrad student at UCLA. This is great. I love seeing this. Folks who are from different places, Austin to Chicago to San Francisco. So thank you so much. This is a wonderful turnout. Appreciate hearing from all of you. Keep using the chat to introduce yourselves, and we'll try to go back to it from time to time as well. So I'm going to get started, and for the first 15 minutes or so, you're going to have to bear with me making a little bit of a presentation about this framework, which I think folks might be interested in. And then, like I said, we will have some time for interaction as well as a reflection conversation with Cynthia as well. So let me get my PowerPoint back up. So give me a second to do that. All right. So what you can expect today in terms of our conversation is the following. First, we're going to set some personal and community agreements about our space. Then I'll take a little time to introduce you to the mapping framework, talk a little bit about how to use it and its components, and also what its relevance might be to today's climate or when we're in crisis moments. And then we'll have a chance to reflect on your own and take some of the questions that I'll pose. And I'll be in conversation with Dr. Cynthia Langtu about her own reflections so that it can provide a model for what folks on here might want to do. And then, as Amalia mentioned, we will have time for Q&A. So please use the Q&A function for any questions you might have directly for me so we can monitor those. And then again, if you want to use the chat for any sort of responses or feedback, you can do that. All right, so moving on. So I know that we're in a virtual space, but I think that it's always really important to set some intentions for any spaces that we're part of. So I want to invite and encourage everyone to create and co-create a community of care in terms of this space, and also to practice empathy for yourselves as well. Want to invite you to ask how rather than why or why not, to really be in a space of spaciousness and possibility, and to get closer to your stretch zone, which might be uncomfortable a little bit, and that is okay. If it is painful, it is important to back off from that stretch zone. And then lastly, just a reminder about confidentiality. Please take the lessons learned here and take them out, because we want this framework to be used widely if it is useful. But in terms of attributing it to individuals, please make sure that that is not done. All right, so I hope that folks are okay with those agreements. If you would like to amend or add any others, again, you can totally feel free to do that in the chat function as well. All right, so I'm going to start off actually telling you a little bit about how this framework emerged, and it's related to this graphic that you see on the screen. And the framework really represents a number of years of my work thinking about the ecosystems that I have been closely part of. And for me, as Amalia mentioned, those ecosystems have been nonprofits and movement-based organizations and coalitions. So I have found oftentimes that I have been on a hot stove when it comes to my ecosystems, and maybe some of you will resonate with that. My hot stove looks different than yours probably. There are different burners on it, but these are the ones that often show up, especially in movement-based organizations or social change organizations. And I found myself feeling misaligned in terms of my own purpose and my role, even though I was very committed to the cause or community and organization I was part of. So oftentimes I found that in organizations that I myself built, as well as organizations that I've been part of, that we often integrate and replicate dominant white cultural norms inside our organizations. And there are lots of folks who have written about this, and there's a Medium piece I wrote about this, which links you to individuals who've been writing about dominant white culture for quite some time, so this is not anything new. But oftentimes, there are certain ways in which we show up and our organizations show up. So sometimes there is this overvaluing of the cult of personality or a brand over the work. Sometimes there's an overvaluing of performance and productivity around how many reports can we write or op-eds that we can publish without assessing impact. Oftentimes there's the emphasis of process without balancing experimentation or the ability to make mistakes and course correct. And sometimes there is the demand of purity, that we have to have the most woke analysis and be consistent all the time. And if not, we might be ostracized or called out in the spaces that we're in. And so in my own journey, I've replicated many of these patterns, particularly myself, in terms of how I've modeled behavior while running a nonprofit and feeling the pressure of being on that hot stove. And on top of that, on top of these dominant white cultural norms that we're more aware of, I think, there are other burners as well. There's the constant cycle of crisis that many of us are part of, including obviously the one we're in now. There are also, I think it's really important to remember that for people who are directly affected, people of color, women, queer and trans communities, undocumented people, working class folks, this crisis cycle leads to direct and vicarious trauma that can show up in our bodies, in our relationships with each other, and in our leadership and engagement and our roles. And lastly, there is, of course, the burner of a lack of resources. All of us are making do with very little for the most part, especially those of us who are working with communities of color. And these external pressures make it sometimes feel that you're building the bridge as you're walking on it. And so this is the ecosystem or environment that led me to feel at times misaligned in terms of my purpose and my roles. And it was about a year or two after the 2016 election that I really felt, again, this crisis inside of myself, of being on a seesaw of outrage to numbness over and over and not being anchored. And that is what led to putting together this framework, mapping our roles in a social change ecosystem. And it has been one that I have changed and amended many times. And the most recent iteration is the one that is particularly focused on moments of crisis. There are three components to this framework. There's this map that you might be familiar with. There is also the definitions of the roles themselves, and then there is a reflection guide. They're all available on my Medium page and also at buildingmovement.org, and we sent them to you in advance as well. Some of you might be familiar with this framework more than others. The one thing that I really want to emphasize is that this is an iterative framework. It's something that should be amended, should be played with and worked on and reworked. So there are a lot of people who have used this framework to say, I have 4 other roles I'd like to add, or I want to change the reflection questions to benefit the organization I work in. And that is absolutely what I hope folks will do, because it is something that is just a starting point, and I'm really hoping that people will use it the way that they want to. So What are some of the outcomes of using this framework? How can it help? So there are 4 that I quickly wanted to mention, and then I wanted to talk a little bit about the assumptions that underlie this framework. So the first outcome is that it is potentially a tool that can bring you into alignment, to get in right relationship with your roles and your values. You'll notice in the middle of the framework or the map, there are a number of social change values that are mentioned. It can also be a catalyst. It can catalyze greater self-awareness and then lead to effective planning, course correction, or experimentation. Another outcome is related to the ecosystem, this understanding that we play roles, but we're part of an ecosystem, whether that is our family, our neighborhood, our organization, our team, our project team, our coalition, our movement. And so how can we use this tool to develop more supportive and sustainable ecosystems? And then lastly, change. How do we bring about systemic change? And that's actually one of the underlying assumptions I wanted to mention about this framework. So one of the reasons that I think this framework is useful in terms of folks working in various different sectors is that it does imply and explicitly say that we're talking about social change here. The roles that are depicted in the map reinforce an approach and framework that is really focused on liberation and equity and inclusion. It's about a recognition of historic and multi-generational oppression and structures of oppression and a commitment to dismantling those and confronting those. So that's why you see those social change values in the middle of the map, and you'll come across a lot of questions that query your own power and privilege that are associated with these roles, and your ecosystem's commitment to institutional and systemic change. So if you're playing particular roles, how do those roles perhaps give you positional authority? How do they prevent maybe others from flexing their own power? Those are questions to think about. Is your ecosystem's approach actually connecting roles that people play to systemic change, and is it being effective? Lastly, the entire map is focused on solidarity and trying to get us not to silo ourselves, right? And so it recognizes that we don't have to play all the roles on the map, but it's really important to know what the interconnections and through lines for others. And finally, the roles don't reflect job titles, and I think that's really important to keep in mind. These are about the roles we play, and so it doesn't matter if there's a hierarchy at your organization or in your ecosystem. It doesn't matter what your job title is or what your positional authority is. It means that folks can play a lot of different roles in their organizations, regardless of what their positional authority is. And so those are some of the underlying assumptions I just wanted people to keep in mind as you either train using this particular framework or if you're using it yourself. So what about crisis moments? How can this particular framework work, especially in moments like this? So if you're supporting people who are really thinking about how they show up in a crisis moment like this one, you might be hearing some of these responses. People thinking that, you know, I need to play every single role I can because this is a really important and vital time. Or folks saying, I'm playing roles in every context now, personally and professionally. Or feeling like they're stuck or numb and don't know where to go, what role to occupy, or recognizing that they need more from their ecosystem. So these might be some of the responses that folks have, and I would love to hear in the chat if any of this kind of connects with you. What are some of the responses that you're feeling or that you're hearing when it comes to this moment in particular, and what people are thinking in terms of the roles that they need to play? Hashtag all the things. Folks are saying, I need to play every role I can. I do feel stuck and numb. A general sense of apathy. Even organizations, Alicia says, feeling that they have to take on everything right now. Mana says, feeling stuck and uncertain. Feeling that I need to carry the weight of everything in this moment, feeling confused, vulnerable, hard to discern the way forward. Am I acting quickly enough? right? And to me, some of hearing this, fear of losing my job, fear of losing funding, some of these responses that you all are putting into the chat, and thank you for doing that, really also to me come back to the graphic that I showed of the pressure cooker and the hot stove, because this sense of I need to respond, I need to be on the front end of it, putting it all out there, it has an impact, right, in terms of your psychic energy, your emotional energy, your physical space. And so that's one way it's affecting folks. But another way is this, again, this push towards productivity and this sense of, and it's something that I deal with all the time, as many of my close friends know, how to play roles in all of these contexts constantly. And someone just said that. I play, as a person of color, a lot of the time I'm feeling like I have to play roles in both contexts or more: work, family, community, nonprofit, etc. Right. Yeah. So I just want to, I encourage you to take a look at the chat because folks are really putting in, I think, some of these responses that I put up, as well as many others as well. So it is such an uncertain time. It's a shifting time, and it's kind of messed us up in terms of what the roles were that we used to play and the ones that we might be playing now. I would say that for moments of crisis, this tool can be important to track your fatigue, to also understand if you are actually playing too many roles, if you don't have support from your ecosystem, and to really understand what the impact is on you psychically and emotionally and physically as well. So I often recommend taking this tool or going through this exercise at least once a month when there is sort of a crisis moment, so that you can also track and monitor how you've shifted. So that's one quick piece I wanted to mention there as a call to action and a recommendation. So the tool is really a three-step process, very simple. The first is, and if you're a trainer, you could do this. If you're running a workshop using this tool, or if you're doing this on your own or in a group setting, first find where are you and who's in your ecosystem? How do you map this out? And I'll show you an example soon. The second is to reflect and learn. What is the story that's emerging about you and your ecosystem once you map yourself out? And it could be that you are learning that your ecosystem is not strong enough, or that the through lines are not clear enough. You could recognize that there are too many people playing particular roles in your ecosystem. You could recognize that you yourself are playing way too many roles, or perhaps you've been playing a role that you've played for 10 or 15 years, and it's time to maybe think about making a shift. And so that reflection and learning piece, whether it's through the reflection guide that I put together or other reflection questions you come up with, it's super useful to think about that. And then thirdly, plan and course correct, right? This is a tool that hopefully is part of a process that uses a liberatory framework to plan and shift. So set 1 to 2 BHAGs, which are big, hairy, audacious goals. Something that comes from Jim Collins and his book Built to Last, which I think can apply in the nonprofit sector and the movement sector, or any other sector as well. So what are those big, hairy, audacious goals? It can just be 1 to 2 that you could set for yourself, and who could be an accountability partner for yourself as well in terms of moving towards those. So it's a really simple 3-step process: find, reflect and learn, plan or course correct. So I want to just, I'm going to close in just a couple of minutes once I go through the roles that are in the map, because folks have a lot of questions about those sometimes. And I encourage you to put the questions into the Q&A portion, please, if you have any, about how to use this particular map and the framework. And I'm definitely going to go back to the chat when we have our Q&A portion to see what folks are saying there as well. But I want to share a little bit about what the roles mean, and then show you a map, and we'll then take some time for you to work on this exercise on your own before we come back and do a reflection. So these are the roles that I mentioned that are on the map or the framework, but they are by no means comprehensive, and really recommend that folks come up with others. So I just wanted to go through these with a contextual orientation in mind to the moment that we're in right now. So weavers are people who see the through lines of connection. And so in this moment, I think of the activists who are linking the effects of this pandemic to the decarceration of jails and detention centers, to climate justice, to access to healthcare. Experimenters, these are the people who see a void or a gap and they immediately innovate and invent, and they oftentimes take risks. So these are folks who are setting up mutual aid associations in their neighborhoods and their communities because the system is broken. Frontline responders, these are people who marshal and organize resources very quickly to respond to a crisis in their community. So in this moment, this could be the healthcare workers, emergency personnel, as well as groups that are on the front lines, like food banks or domestic violence agencies. Visionaries, these are people who are reminding us of our North Star and where we need to head. And in this moment, a visionary that I keep going back to is the writer Arundhati Roy, who talks about the pandemic being a portal, and I'll return to her words at the end of this workshop as well. Builders, these are people who are ready to implement. They're the ones who put together the project, they've got the project plan in place, and they know how and who is going to do it. They mocha it all out, and they're ready to go. These, for me, in this moment, are the organizers who are finding different ways to build power through digital organizing and the like, even if we can't meet in person and do direct actions and outreach the way that we used to. Caregivers, these are the folks who are nurturing and nourishing people around us. So I think of, in this moment, the people who are sewing masks, the people who are caring for the elderly, going to grocery stores and the like. Disruptors. Disruptors often get a pretty bad rap. I myself find myself in the role of disruptor often. These are folks who are ready to say the risky and uncomfortable thing to shake up the status quo. So I often think in this moment of people who are very clear about the fact that this pandemic is not an equalizer in many ways, that there are communities of color, and particularly Black and Indigenous communities, who are bearing the burden and weight of what this pandemic is doing, and that it is because of systemic disparities that have affected communities of color. Healers. Healers are people who tend to trauma. And they do that by being very discerning and very empathetic, obviously. And these are the people who really understand the cyclical nature of this pandemic and what is required to heal. These are the folks who are thinking about what the stories are that this moment actually tells us. I think of folks who are writing quarantines and Corona Chronicles and really chronicling and documenting what is happening right now and how it connects to the past through art and music and movement. Guides, these are the folks who use their third eye. They have a quality of discernment. So the people in this moment who say, we've been here before, we can learn from past crises, and what does that mean? So one of the things that I hope, again, just to reiterate is feel free to play with these definitions and feel free to add other roles. But the one thing I want you to think about is it's probably not good to play all these roles at the same time, right? And I think I see folks writing in the chat that sometimes we do that, or we think we have to do that, again, because of that push towards productivity and being responsive. And it's actually takes a great toll on us if we try to sustain this level of activity to play all these roles. The importance of recognizing that there are others who do play these roles, and it's important to create space for them to do that, is just, it's also part of that liberatory framework that I mentioned earlier, to understand when we can step aside and when we can actually say, you know what, in this moment or in this week, I'm going to play a different role. So I want to show you, keep responding in the chat. I love it. Please share what folks think of these roles and these definitions. And if you have ways to make them even more relevant to your work, please do that. So I want to show you a map, a framework of what you might want to do when you're working with this. And a point that Tuhina makes is so important. She writes, I realize this also depends on the ecosystem, and different ecosystems require different roles for me. And I think that's a critical point. That's right. because every single ecosystem that you might be part of is different. You're not going to necessarily play the role that you play in your family, that you might be playing in your organization, right, at work, or even in your volunteer work, right? You might be playing different roles. So I often tell folks to think of this as a multidimensional way of looking at the roles that you play. And so you may want to create these maps depending on the different ecosystems you're part of. I often do that just to get a sense of why I'm so tired or drained sometimes, to understand the layers of ecosystems that I'm part of and what they're demanding of me. So this particular map is one that I did for myself just a few days ago, and I did it thinking of the ecosystem of both personal as well as a coalition that I'm part of. And what I realized, and let me just explain what I did, is I went in and I put a star on all of the roles that I have been playing, and I put an arrow next to the people that occupy certain roles in my ecosystem. So that's the first step, find yourself and find your ecosystem. And then what I did was I did some reflection. And what I learned is that I end up, I'm playing very similar roles that I naturally or normally play. Frontline responder, storyteller is a little bit new for me. Weaver is also a little bit new for me in terms of connecting different movements and ideas. Disruptor is often common for me, and builder is very common for me, kind of building something, putting something together and the like. I also noticed that I am playing a caregiver role in a different way. That's why it's purple. I have a 9-year-old son, and although I do care for him, obviously, all the time, or outside of this moment, I realized that the type of care that I am giving to him is different right now. And so I kind of looked at that, and then I looked at the ecosystem and realized that my ecosystem is very similar in terms of folks fall into my ecosystem in terms of the roles I play, if that makes sense. So I realized that I'm attracting a lot of disruptors and builders and frontline responders. Those are the folks in my ecosystem. And so a revelation for me is, how do I bring in, I have a longing to learn from visionaries and guides. And so one of the calls to action for myself that I made is, how do I know there are folks in my network who play those roles. Maybe some of you do, and you would volunteer to be that for me. But how do I bring in visionaries and guides and caregivers as well? And I also recognize that I want to be in other roles. I want to be in experimenter and visionary roles, because disrupting and frontline responding is something that I know to do, but it is also something that I think I can perhaps move away from a little bit. So those are some of the ways in which I use this map to learn. And folks are saying in the chat, sometimes you get stuck in roles that are most comfortable for you. Yes, that's exactly how I feel about frontline responder or disruptor for me, and trying to figure out how I can move away from that. And also what kind of privilege I assert by claiming those roles all the time, who doesn't get to be in those spaces because I'm in those spaces. So asking those questions as well. And someone else said earlier in the chat that I just wanted to do a +1 to, and I see if I can find it, is about how there is expected labor from Black women or women of color, from people who are asked to play certain roles all the time in an ecosystem. And this is something that I want to just kind of do a +1 for, because it's true. There are many workshops that I've done where women of color will say, I'm sort of relied upon to be the caregiver all the time, or I'm relied upon to be and play this role of builder and putting stuff together all the time. So I wanted to just kind of +1 that, because I think that's a really important point as well. So again, this is just an example of what a mapping framework can do. And what it does, again, is allow me to reflect on what my ecosystem looks like, where I need support from, and what kinds of ways I want to shift myself, right? It also tells me a little bit about the roles I've always played and where I need to stretch. So the revelations might be different depending on the day that you take it, or as Tahina mentioned earlier, the ecosystem that you put in place when you take this, right? But the more that you can work on it with a multidimensional context and also with some other people, it can help quite a bit. So with that, let me actually bring us back to actually turning it over to you and asking you to do something similar. So some of you, I think, may have done this if you were able to take some time to do it earlier, and if not, that's totally fine. But I'm going to give about 6 to 8 minutes for all of you to take your turn in working through this map. So if you have it in front of you, great. If you don't, I'll pull it up again. And so what you want to do is identify yourself on the map, right? What roles are you playing in this moment in particular? Identify others in your ecosystem and just reflect on what story is emerging. You don't need to answer the other questions if there isn't time, but what story is emerging? What are some immediate revelations you have? And if you don't mind sharing them into the chat, that would be great as well. So interested in knowing the roles and the story, some revelation, some aha observation. So let me see if I can pull the map up again. When I say what story is emerging, I mean when you look at your map after you map yourself out and your ecosystem out, what does it tell you? Like for mine, it told me that I am playing a lot of the same roles I always play. Or it told me that my ecosystem is mainly made up of people who play the same roles I do, so I might not be learning much. Is there some level of aha revelation that comes for you as you look at the map after you find yourself on it and your ecosystem on it? So I'm going to give folks about 6 minutes to do that. And then when we return, I'll be in conversation with Cynthia Langtew about her own experience with this map and what story has emerged for her. So we'll be back in just 5 to 6 minutes. All right, we're coming back on. Thank you to those of you who took the time to take the exercise, but also put in your reflections. I was trying to capture a few of them. The one thing that I honestly found myself feeling is y'all are doing a lot. And there's a sense of kind of fatigue that I'm getting from so many folks because of this moment, but also this sense of feeling like this is what I have to do all the time, right? So I'm hoping that this conversation and this framework will enable you to query that a little bit more and to find support in your ecosystem. Others talked about how it's not possible to be a solo agent, right? That I need to be part of a broader ecosystem. Some of you talked about how your ecosystem isn't necessarily going a space where you can be what you want to be. And so the question then for me comes up, are there other ecosystems where you can flex those roles, right? So that you're still staying true to purpose. Guilt and fatigue, that is clear. That's coming up a lot. And I've been there, as I mentioned several times during the course of this. So I want to bring in now a dear, dear friend of mine and an amazing person in of herself. Dr. Cynthia is a professor at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. She focuses on multicultural psychology as well as the well-being of people who are underserved, refugee communities, immigrant communities, and communities of color. She is also a board member at Point Source Youth, which works to end youth homelessness. She's based in Chicago. And she, more than all of that, is a gracious, kind spirit who is consistently lifting up other women of color. I have been the lucky beneficiary of that several times because of her. And so Cynthia graciously volunteered to be in conversation with me to share a little bit about her own observations taking this particular exercise. So Cynthia, welcome. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be a part of this conversation about this really important process, I think.
Yeah. So I just want to start by asking you, can you share a little bit about what roles you find yourself playing, especially in this moment, and what story emerged for you? And if you can even connect it with some of the comments that we're getting on the chat, that would be great.
Yeah, there's so many things that come up for me. And one of the things that I really appreciate about this as a systemic and community psychologist is the idea of ecosystems, right? And part of the challenge for me is that I'm part of so many ecosystems. So I'm in academia, but I'm also a social activist and I work with different agencies. So I think about how all of these ecosystems are connected and the energy that I'm expending in all of those settings, right? So I think of myself, when I look at the roles, I think of myself as a caregiver and healer, right? And those are related, but in different ways. The caregiving for me is the one-on-one, the healer is the larger system. Of course, I think of myself as a guide as well. And I think it's one of the reasons that I'm drawn to teaching and being in that role. And a weaver, you know, I find maybe it's my Haitian background or cultural, but I find that I see interconnections. And that's one of the gifts that I've been offered. I think that connects so much to so many of the comments that are made, that there are so many roles, but in different systems that are at play.
And in terms of your ecosystem, what are some observations you have about the ways in which other people interact in the ecosystem, which you mentioned is so important as a psychologist and as a professor in academia?
Sure. I find that when I'm in those roles in particular, that one of the things that lots of folks are talking about is the energy, and you talked about the energy as well. That when I'm in the roles in which I'm comfortable, that I move with ease, right? And that I don't feel off kilter, and I feel a forward energy. And especially during this time, that's something that's really important for me. But I think also one of the things that's been bubbling up for me as I did this process is that I can fly under the radar pretty easily, right? And folks had to come and find me to offer some of the skills that I have to offer. But when they do, I find that I have a lot to offer. And so a couple of the areas that have come up for me, particularly as I think about social injustice, and that's such an important piece for me in structural violence, you know, the idea of being a disruptor. right? The fact that I do see, structural violence and how it's played out over time and space, particularly for people that look like me, but then others as well, and how there's a bubbling up inside of me to do something about that. And then also the piece about storytelling. So I think that the ways that my ecosystem have supported that is being able to see how other folks engage around those roles and take cues from them. But then also I have to be careful about not jumping into their space or into those roles and taking over those spaces, but then also depleting myself, right? And finding ways to stay energized, but also take risks and chances, particularly at this time.
Yeah, yeah. And can you share a little bit, Cynthia, about how you think this framework might be useful in different sectors? And we have a lot of folks, I think, in the educational sector, especially on this particular webinar, as well as the social activism space. What are some ways that people could utilize this framework?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think one of the reasons that this resonated for me so immediately when I saw the mapping is that I work with a lot of agencies around being trauma informed. And I have the blessing of working with an academic institution as well as many social service agencies that are mission driven and actually trying to live out their mission. And as I've said before, that's a double-edged sword because so many folks are so mission driven that they can give themselves to those missions and the mission and the values and the work that they do and become depleted. And so it's important to have trauma informed agencies and balanced teams. And I think that doing this mapping exercise, both individually, but as well as a team, and thinking intentionally about having balanced teams and what folks bring to the table is such an important exercise. So I think in the academic setting, but in social service agencies that are aiming to be trauma informed and balanced, that this is a great tool and exercise.
Great. So one more question, and then please feel free to share any other observations or calls to action that you might have when you respond. There's been a lot of talk in our chat, but also I mentioned this too, around the sustainability of our work, especially if we are part of communities that have historically been affected by the systems of oppression in this country. How do those of us continue to do this work, right? How can we sustain ourselves if we are playing so many of these roles, and especially if we're also directly affected by what's happening outside of us?
Yeah, that's such an important question. And I think the idea of coming together and mapping our roles, right, and understanding which roles feel like they come with ease and which roles feel like they're sticky and hard but needed. And particularly as a woman of color, you know, I rise to the occasion, I'll come to the rescue, but that's not always helpful, right? And so recognizing that me coming to the rescue is not necessarily helpful, but thinking about the entire team and the intentionality around building that team and building coalitions and building solidarity and making sure that we're remaining open and energized and not depleted so that we can sustain ourselves. And so it means looking more broadly, looking across different sectors or coalitions to make sure that we are intentional about building teams that work well together and actually get everything done that we need to do, and folks using the skills that they have and not depleting those skills or overusing those skills, or having folks step outside of the roles that they're meant to do, right?
Right, because they're not job titles, like functions.
Yeah.
Any last kind of call to action? So folks are saying coming to the rescue is not always helpful, is important. Someone who asked what trauma-informed care means. So I don't know if you have a call to action for folks that kind of wraps that in as well.
Yeah. What does trauma-informed care mean? It means that we're building agencies, right, that care and see the folks that are working within the agencies, but also care and see about the folks with whom we're working. And that we're centering the ways that structural violence has impacted both the staff that's working together and the folks with whom we're working, and that we're simultaneously working at dismantling the structural violence that has caused trauma, you know, across the world, as well as doing the work that we're doing. You know, centering those who have been marginalized and making sure that those who have been marginalized are in front and center in all that we do. And that includes the folks working on the staff, right? That's not just the folks that are outward facing, or our students or the folks out there, but us as professors, us as the staff that are working together, us as the executive directors, that we're all included in seeing the ways that historical and current trauma and structural violence have influenced us, and working hard at dismantling it together. The other piece that I would say is that we can't do this alone, right? We are interconnected, and in order to do this, there needs to be solidarity across so many movements. We need to really see and hear each other, right? And know that my healing is directly related to your healing, and that together, and I think that this pandemic time, that Roy article has blown my mind, that this is this pandemic can be used as a portal, and what we see on the other side is what we bring together. And I hope that solidarity around all of these important values is what we bring to the other side together.
That's great. And that's perfect, because I'm going to end by talking about that pandemic as a portal. So you read my mind, as usual. Thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you. And there's a lot of love for you in the chat, so you should take a look at it when you can. So I just wanted to, you know, we're almost done. This went faster than I thought. So stay with us, please, for a little bit longer. So how do you use this mapping framework? A couple of ways here: quarterly reflection tool, maybe monthly, especially in this moment, icebreaker, intro sessions at your staff meetings on Zoom, staff retreats, board meetings, mapping your leadership, learning from that. If you're a coach, I'm a coach, and I use this quite a bit in the work that I do with folks, and a political education tool. This is not something that just needs to be used in the context of, you know, a workspace. It can be used with really anyone thinking about what their role is in social change spaces. So I'm going to ask Amalia to come back on, because we're going to take a little bit of time to do some Q&A if there are any questions that came up, Amalia. If you all have questions, you can put them into the Q&A. And I pulled this cartoon up because I think it's important that Lawrence never goes anywhere without his ecosystem. So keep your ecosystem close to you. Somebody wants us to go back to the last screen. I will do that. Okay, go ahead, Amalia.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So we have quite a few questions that are coming in. We're going to do our best to get to as many as possible. All right. So the first question, is it ideal that an ecosystem has all roles covered?
I don't know about the ideal. I think that you want your ecosystem to reflect the values and purpose of what you're trying to build towards. So if your ecosystem's purpose is around interconnectedness or resiliency or equity and inclusion, some of these roles might actually be really important, right? You don't have to have every single role covered either to answer that question directly. But what I often say is, when I do a mapping for an organization, I ask the organization to think about whether they're too heavy in particular areas. So I find that a lot of organizations in the social change space often have a lot of builders, because a lot of us know how to build, you know, we know those project plans, right? And we can timeline it out and MOPA the roles, we know it. But oftentimes we don't have visionaries, or as someone actually said in the chat, our expectations are not very clear of what is expected of us, right? And so trying to figure out if you're overloaded in particular areas, trying to make sure that you do have visionaries and guides, right? And not just builders or disruptors, right? So kind of trying to find that balance is important. Otherwise, we oftentimes end up doing the same thing over and over and find ourselves not being as effective.
Thank you. Somebody else is asking, how do you, or how would you build alliances with people outside of your ecosystems, but who could potentially fill an important and missing role within one of yours?
Oh, that's a great point. I mean, I think the question sort of contains the answer within itself in a way. Yeah, it's absolutely important to think about how if you're working in a particular organizational space, that you don't have to cover all of the roles, that there might be others in an adjacent coalition, an adjacent ecosystem that you could learn from. That also brings us back to the point that Cynthia made so clearly around breaking out of silos and building solidarity. So it's breaking out of silos with our own roles, but it's also between ecosystems themselves. So really thinking about the overlapping nature of ecosystems is really important from a standpoint of doing coalition work or cross-racial work or cross-movement work in particular.
Great, thank you. A lot of great questions coming in. So you have a project called Solidarity Is. What are some of the lessons that people should keep in mind if they're using the Solidarity framework or even in relation to the mapping framework?
Yeah, so I do. And so the Solidarity Is project is really focused on how do we build practices of transformative solidarity that are not transactional, right? How do we go beyond hashtags and slogans to actually being in deep solidarity with one another? Both in terms of individuals, but also in terms of movements and communities. So a lot of what I have learned is that, number one, and Cynthia mentioned this too, the importance of centering and uplifting the leadership of those who have been on the margins. The second is to have a framework that is focused on addressing and ending anti-Black racism in particular. If you are a racial justice organization or an organization committed to social change, and you don't have a framework around ending anti-Black racism, that would be a cornerstone regarding solidarity practice. And then a third piece is to really think about the messiness of solidarity practice, because it's interrelationship oriented, right? It's a relational space, it's messy. The dynamics are messy. And so how do we kind of build the strength and the resources that we need to kind of engage in the messiness without it obviously taking a toll on us in a painful way or a traumatic way? How do we refrain from engaging in oppression Olympics? How do we make sure we don't engage in movement call-outs? These are all ways in which we can engage in a more transformative way that changes ourselves as well as the organizations that we're part of. So those are three frames of solidarity practice. There's more over at solidarityis.org.
Thank you. One last question that's a little big, but Deepa, what is your vision for humanity? I mean, we're going through so much right now with all the frameworks.
It's kind of big.
Just absolutely amazing and so important. How can we bring that into our current new reality? What's your vision? Where do we go?
Yeah. So that's great, because that is actually how I'm going to end our conversation, to be honest. So it's 5 o'clock, so I think in about 5 minutes, we should be good to go. I do see, and thank you, Amalia, for picking those questions out. I do see that there are others on here. I would love to answer them. So I'm going to try to do that. And if not, you can also reach out to me. I'll be providing you with my contact information. But to respond to that question, and I think others, let me get back here. So a lot of this, honestly, has been, for me, feeling like I am looking to a visionary to understand what is demanded in this moment, right? Because I myself, as I mentioned earlier, am unable to play that role. For lots of different reasons. I'm unable to access that piece of me. And so Arundhati Roy has emerged for me as someone who has kind of put a vision out that I really resonate with. And so she said, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one's no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. And so the question that I've been kind of thinking through is, as we move through this portal, right, and some of us have the privilege of doing that and some of us clearly don't, but what is it that we're leaving behind? What is it we're taking through? And where are we headed? And I think that perhaps this framework can enable us to answer some of those questions, right? What roles do I want to play in this new world? What kind of ecosystem do I want to build or reshape, and why is that important for me? So some other ways, some other calls to action that I wanted to quickly put down or to raise with folks who are thinking about this moment, giving time and money and skills to the front lines. If folks here are raising money for frontline responders, I urge you to put that information into the chat. It is so important to do that in this moment. Understanding that it's also important to center and name what is happening right now, that we have to name the disparities that are happening and to whom they're happening and why they're happening, that it isn't possible to just kind of look away or dismiss what the pandemic is laying bare for all of us. A third piece is learning about the interconnectedness of issues and movements and global solidarities. So the intersections of a lot of the issues that are coming to bear and the movements that are making those clear, really getting clear about that ourselves is important. And then lastly, imagining a post-COVID-19 recovery and society, and having that be rooted in an analysis that is a feminist analysis, that is grounded in the realities and experiences of people of color, indigenous folks, queer and trans communities, focused on the healing of the earth, and of course, based on building solidarity with each other. So Roy ends her piece by saying, we can choose to walk through it, the portal, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. So what are you leaving behind? What are you taking through, and where are you headed, and with whom are some of the questions that might allow us to have a deeper engagement with this framework as well. So with that, encourage you to reach out to me. My book is called Reducing America. It's about something very different, post 9/11 America. The podcast is called Solidarity Is This. It is on iTunes or anywhere where you listen to your podcast. I'm also at Building Movement Project, buildingmovement.org. We do amazing work on strengthening organizations, do social change, and you can reach me on Twitter. You can reach me via email. And I'm really happy to connect with all of you on trainings around this framework, workshops on sustainability, particularly in movement spaces, facilitation, and of course, speaking engagements related to some of these concepts. So I want to thank you. I'm going to turn it back to Amelia in a minute, but I really want to thank you all for being here. This has been very rejuvenating for me and reinforcing in many ways. Really appreciate Cynthia Langtu for taking the time to join us and her observations and insights. Much love to Amalia and Speak Out for making this even possible. And all of you, thank you, stay well, stay healthy, and really looking forward to connecting with each of you online, but also in person over the course of the year. Turn it back over to you, Amalia.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. If you'd like to learn more about Speak Out and the work of its incredible speakers and artists, you can visit speakoutnow.org. You can also consider bringing our speakers like Deepa virtually to your campus or community group. There's been some mentions about a Facebook group, so we're going to work on that and spread the word. If you know folks who want access to this webinar, you can go onto our website as well, or email us if you have any questions. We also hope that you'll consider making a donation on our website or in the survey to support a fund we've set up to support our speakers and artists who've been impacted by the cancellation of events nationwide, many of them incredible activists and community leaders. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Everybody stay safe out there, and in solidarity, we're out. Thank you.